Xyralis's biosensors flared with violent warning colors as her probing fingers detected a sudden, rigid tissue mass rapidly developing in Jace Vance's pelvic region. The diagnostic chimes shrieked, painting the sterile examination room in pulsing crimson light. She withdrew her hands instantly, her secondary hearts hammering against her ribs. What fresh internal trauma had the ion blast triggered? How exactly does a healer save a patient whose own body becomes a mystery? The scent of scorched copper had still clung to his uniform then, exactly 90 minutes before the diagnostic alarms shattered the quiet. He had limped into the medical bay, favoring his left side. Beneath the glaring halogens of the healing nexus, Jace Vance lay half-naked on the examination platform. The blast in ion drive array Sector 4 had thrown him against a bulkhead. External lacerations were minimal. Internal damage, however, was the primary concern for a species with such fragile, fluid-heavy anatomy. Xyralis initiated the deep tissue protocols. She activated the shimmering biosensors on her fingertips. The microfilaments illuminated with a pale, clinical blue light designed to scan internal trauma, map tissue density, and track erratic blood flow. To her people, physical touch was solely a diagnostic tool or a biological imperative. It was a sterile exchange of data, yet the human medical codex she had studied emphasized something entirely different. Humans relied heavily on tactile empathy. Their nervous systems required physical contact to regulate stress hormones, meaning touch served as a vital form of communication and emotional stabilization, not just data collection, which meant his pulse should be settling under her steady, diagnostic pressure. Instead, the readings spiked. She traced her four-fingered hands across his chest. His skin was unnervingly warm. The heat radiated upward, seeping through her gloves and into her own thermal receptors. Jace's breathing hitched. Xyralis paused, observing the way his abdominal muscles tightened involuntarily beneath her palms. He was not vocalizing pain. His jaw was clenched, but his eyes were tracked entirely on her movements, dark and dilated. The air between them felt inexplicably heavy, thick with a strange, unspoken static that defied her instruments. A low hum vibrated from the life support monitors. She moved her hands lower, tracing the curvature of his lower ribs to assess the structural integrity of his internal organs. The biological data gathering was standard procedure, but the physiological response she was receiving was entirely irrational. His heart rate was accelerating to dangerous levels, hammering against his sternum like a trapped avian creature. His core temperature was rising, localized heat signatures blossoming across her monitors. Skin flushed a deep, saturated red across his collarbones and crept up the line of his throat. Xyralis frowned, her clinical detachment warring with a creeping sense of unfamiliar urgency. She had treated hundreds of humans, yet she had never seen trauma manifest as a localized thermal event without an accompanying infection. If you want to understand how an alien doctor decodes the most confusing human condition, subscribe and join our archives. Her fingers pressed gently into his lower abdomen. She needed to clear the pelvic region of micro-shrapnel. Jace inhaled sharply. It was a ragged, wet sound that echoed in the quiet bay. Xyralis tilted her head, her auditory receptors swiveling to capture the precise frequency of his breath. Was it agony? He shifted his weight on the examination table. Xyralis, he muttered, his voice dropping an entire octave. You might want to hold up a second. She hesitated, but medical protocols dictated that an incomplete scan could result in fatal internal hemorrhaging. The blast had been powerful enough to shatter the array's magnetic containment field. She could not leave any quadrant unchecked. She pressed deeper into the soft tissue above his hip bone, her biosensors searching for microscopic tears in his vascular network. The tension in his body was undeniable. His hands gripped the edges of the metal platform so hard his knuckles turned white. She did not understand why he was fighting the examination. Her touch was calibrated for optimal gentleness. Yet, the closer she moved to a center of mass, the more his biological systems rebelled. Jace squeezed his eyes shut. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple, catching the sterile overhead light. Zoralis calculated a high probability of concealed internal distress. She could not halt the procedure. Her oath forbade it. The human body was notoriously fragile, prone to cascading failures if left untreated. She adjusted her stance. Her clinical protocols required a full sweep of the lower quadrants to rule out magnetic resonance tearing. "Doc, seriously," Jace gritted out, his voice strained, thick with an emotion she could not easily categorize. "It is just a biological thing. I am fine. Stop." But the automated scan trajectory was already locked in. She lowered her hands, pressing her glowing fingertips into the soft tissue just above his hip bone. The alarms shrieked their crimson warning as her sensors were overwhelmed by the sudden rigid tissue mass developing beneath her touch. Before she could trigger the surgical isolation field, Jace abruptly sat up on his elbows. He reached down and wrapped his large, calloused hand around her slender wrist. He physically stopped her movement. The grip was firm, yet entirely devoid of hostility. "Computer, mute medical alerts," Jace commanded. The room plunged into a sudden, ringing silence. The flashing red lights dissolved back into the calm blue of the standby mode. Jace released her wrist. He ran a hand over his face, his skin deeply flushed, his gaze fixed firmly on the far wall. The mass her sensors had detected was not a tumor. It was not a parasitic swelling. It was not a hematoma. "It is an autonomic nervous system response," Jace explained. His voice sounded rough and quiet in the vast room. "To touch. Human touch starvation meets, well, whatever this is. It is called arousal." Zoralis stepped back from the examination platform. Her processors spun rapidly, aligning this new vocabulary with her medical codex. Arousal. A reproductive and emotional physiological state triggered by physical proximity. It was not an injury. It was a visceral reaction to her proximity. She processed the profound vulnerability of his biology. The rigid data gathering of her profession had collided completely with the irrational physiological needs of his species. "I am mandating a 48-hour observation period," Zoralis stated. She carefully smoothed the front of her uniform to ensure no delayed trauma manifests from the ion blast. Jace looked up at her. A small, knowing smile broke through the tension in his jaw. "Observation. Right." The following 2 solar cycles completely shifted the axis of her understanding. They did not spend the time running cellular diagnostics. They sat together in the quiet dimness of the recovery ward. Jace talked about the endless, crushing isolation of deep space assignments. Zoralis listened, observing the way his shoulders slowly unknotted the longer she stayed near. She learned that bridging the gap between their species required patience. It required abandoning her rigid parameters and embracing the necessity of connection. They exchanged deliberate non-medical physical contact, sitting in companionable silence for hours. On the final hour of his hold, Zoralis returned to the platform. She deactivated her biosensors, letting the clinical blue light fade entirely from her fingertips. She placed her bare hand flat over his heart, slowly lacing her 4 fingers through his 5. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. "Their shared medical clearance is just the beginning. We will see exactly what happens when their first scheduled meal gets interrupted by a sector-wide blackout in our next transmission."